now to a development in the fight to get Canadian news back on social media. A group of news publishers and broadcasters, and that includes the CBC, are calling for an investigation into Meta's blocking of news sites in this country. They say Meta's moves are anti-competitive and that the company is abusing its dominant position. Meta began blocking news access for Canadians on Facebook and Instagram last week. Now, that is in response to the passing of the Online News Act. That act requires social media companies to pay news outlets for the content shared on their platforms. CBC's David Thurton is following all the developments on this one out of Ottawa. David, tell us more about this complaint.
Yeah, well, usually these news organizations that we are hearing that are filing this complaint, they're usually in the business of competing against one another. They are fiercely competitive to get the big story. But here we have them forming what seems to be like this consortium of publishers and broadcasters to take on this huge web giant, Meta. So how are they doing that, Hannah? Well, they have filed a complaint with the Competition Bureau of Canada. If Canadians have never heard of the Competition Bureau of Canada, it's essentially, one way to describe it is the competition watchdog of this country. They're essentially the cops when it comes to enforcing the laws around competition in Canada. So what they've done, what these news organizations have done is they filed a complaint, and if you read that complaint, Hannah, it essentially says that Meta, which owns Instagram and Facebook, is responsible for they have a market share that is huge when it comes to social media. About almost three quarters of social media is controlled by Meta. And what they have done to block Canadians' access to news harms the news business, harms the ability of newsrooms to post their stories and to drive traffic from these platforms to their sites where they can post ads and create other forms of revenue. So if they block access to Canadian news, they are blocking the ability of these newsrooms to essentially do their job, and they're harming the industry. And so essentially what this boils down to, this consortium of news organizations says, they allege, is an anti-competitive behavior. So let's drill down to who's filing this complaint. It includes, as you mentioned off the top, yes, CBC Radio Canada, also the Canadian Association of Broadcasters, which represents the private broadcasters in our industries, such as the CTV and Global and that kind of stuff, but also another organization that represents hundreds of online and publications and newspapers, such as the Globe, the Star, that kind of thing. That organization is called News Media Canada. I spoke with the president and CEO of that organization. Here's what he had to say.
So essentially what we're looking for is the Bureau to investigate Meta, and then basically to tell Meta that they have to stop this illegal behavior, which is abuse of their dominant position in the marketplace. They control so much of social media in this country, and they're harming publishers and broadcasters in terms of our access to the market, and also therefore hurting us from a revenue perspective.
Now, Hannah, I'm not an expert in competition law or this area, but I did ask Paul whether or not this is going to take a long time for this complaint to work its way through the system. He says that according to the lawyers that these news organizations have been speaking to, this is an open and shut case, and they expect that it will be dealt with expeditiously and in their favor. We'll have to see. We haven't heard from the Competition Bureau yet, but we'll have to see.
Yeah, that's something to watch for sure. David, what are the news companies hoping to accomplish from this?
Yeah, just put really simply, they want Facebook, Instagram to lift their block on Canadian news. They want Canadians to be able to access the stories that get posted to these platforms. Also, what they also want to see is that when that block is lifted, that they don't toy with the algorithm to somehow suppress Canadian stories so it gets buried in the feed. So if they don't get that, if the Competition Bureau cannot secure that, because remember, they're the cop, they do have prosecutorial powers, and so they are calling on the Competition Bureau to escalate this to a competition court, what's called the Competition Tribunal. So yeah, they're saying that don't be afraid to escalate this essentially to the Competition Bureau.
What about reaction from Meta, and what is the government saying about this?
Yeah, so I could quickly tell you that Meta is essentially sending us a statement that refers us to previous comments they've made on this issue in the past. Of course, What's prompting all of this is the government's Online News Act. The federal government's attempt to get the web giants such as Meta to compensate newsrooms for the content that's on their website. And so what Meta is saying essentially, Hannah, is that they continue to oppose this act. They continue to say that Canadians aren't going on their platforms to access news. They want really, viral videos that are light in terms of content, not really the heavy news that we tend to discuss on this program. And look, you could see that statement from Pascal St. Onge as well. So we're getting reaction from the federal government as well. I'll read it really quickly. She says, Facebook knows they have no obligations under the Act right now. They have not participated in the regulatory process. They would rather block their users from accessing good quality and local news instead of paying their fair share to news organizations. So, what we see here is really a lot of people, a lot of players in this story digging into their positions. We see that with the complaint that's being filed with the Competition Bureau by these news organizations. We see that with Meta essentially not changing their stance, saying they're moving ahead with this news blockage. And of course, the federal minister responsible for this piece of legislation, the Online News Act, saying that, essentially Meta's cutting off Canadian news content. So things are escalating and not getting any better, it seems.
Okay. David Thurton in Ottawa, thank you for breaking this all down.
Anytime.